So hi everyone. I was so honored to come and present last year and grateful that I was invited back again this year. Now just a quick disclaimer. The complex around language deprivation is very complex. I don't have the hours it might take to give you a good survey of that. I got 20 minutes. So how to condense all of that in this amount of time is just beyond me. So I'm going to try to get some highlights, some important themes that will match the theme of the conference. But I'm happy to talk with anybody later on about specific questions you might have, because I really do have to kind of speed through at a high level. Hey, don't get ahead of me here. See the title here, Dry Hot Dog. Anybody know what that means? Could you do it again? We need to have somebody up there shadowing. What does it mean? It means the discussion's over. We don't want to talk anymore, not any greater depth. Yeah, it's a moot discussion. Or it's been discussed long enough, I should say. It's time to move on. Auditory deprivation, language deprivation, I feel clear on that myself, and I think it's time for us to move on. But I will share with you some research and some concepts to see if you agree with me. There'll be a question about that at the end. First, language acquisition. There's a famous question in developmental science about nature versus nurture. And really, first language acquisition relies on both. What I've noticed about language acquisition is the importance of exposure prior to the age of 5. There's something about the plasticity of the brain from birth to that age that is just ready to soak up the language that it has access to. But at the age of 5, dry hot dog. It's ready to move on to other things. The brain has lots of things to focus on, not just learning language. And so you see this steep upturn here of language acquisition up to a point where it starts to decrease. It's around the age of 5 where we notice that those who haven't had language exposure yet never become truly fluent in their language, whether it be a signed or a spoken language. But we see this happening very often to deaf students, more so than others who have very late exposure to language. It's critical to have this exposure during the critical period, during the red lines here, because research has proven that it has adverse effects if you don't. Along the bottom here we have ages, 0 through 5. At the beginning, the brain is just ready, looking for language. And then at home, you would normally expect it to be exposure from family, then from peers, and from school. It's the experience and biology that work in tandem. For first language acquisition, you see it going up to about the age of 3, at which point the brain really has the structure of its language. There's still some more learning to be done, but that foundation is pretty much in place. And then we see a shift from experience, which keeps going, and biology, which the brain thinks it's really pretty much done with things, but it still keeps learning because experience picks up. Is that clear? Any other concerns or anything not clear? I want you to keep that in mind. There's been this great concern about auditory deprivation for a child who has some form of hearing loss at birth. They're not going to develop spoken language, and the key to that is giving them auditory access to that spoken language. Historically, sign language has been discounted as having any value. The focus has all been on auditory access. But in the last 10 to 15 years, we've seen a more deaf-led approach that's gotten stronger, and which is led primarily by the deaf community. The main problem, though, is framed differently. It has an access to language, not access to sound. The traditional approach tries to fix the barriers to sound to give the child access to that. But the deaf community wants the child to have access to language. It's language exposure that is the greatest concern. Is that distinction clear? Now, I'm not that much of a lecturer. I like to be more interactive. I'm going to show you some studies, and I want you to put on your scientist cap on. I'm not the only expert in this room. You guys are experts too. And you also will then discuss things with each other once I'm through with my part. Okay? Okay. I'm going to show you some studies looking at what each of these hypotheses in turn would predict. The auditory deprivation approach predicts that hearing children will do better than signing and non-signing implanted children. They predict that would always be the case, because hearing children have full access to auditory input. They predict that there would be no difference between signing and non-signing implanted children, because they're deaf. But the other approach that's concerned about language deprivation predicts there'd be no difference between signing implanted and hearing children, because they both would have a foundation in an accessible language. It also predicts that signing implanted children would do better than non-signing implanted children, because they have more access to language and during that critical period of age 0 to 5. So I'm going to show you in turn the results of some studies, and I want you to say which ones do you think they're consistent, which of these approaches are they consistent with? This is from a very well-known study looking at kids who have had the cochlear implants and comparing them with hearing children to measure their auditory description and speech comprehension. These yellow marks here show the scores of the deaf children with cochlear implants. And in black, that's the performance of normally hearing children. What do you notice?
I noticed that with the black line, it's not the same as the yellow lines. They're not equal. They don't have the same potential.
Do you agree or disagree with that comment? Any other observations? Anyone? Yeah, there is great variability. But you see that the hearing children perform within a range that is kind of relatively narrow, whereas the children with cochlear implants have a greater variability. But do you think that's consistent with the language deprivation approach or the auditory deprivation approch?
Auditory, both.
Who says auditory deprivation? Who thinks this is measuring based on auditory deprivation? 4 or 5. Who thinks language deprivation? Don't be shy. Remember, you're the experts, not me. Who thinks it's from the auditory deprivation approach? Who thinks it's from the language deprivation approach? Who isn't sure? I want to get a clear picture here. Yeah? Why not both?
Yeah, I think it's both. Because with the auditory, there's already been the ability to hear removed when you have a cochlear implant, but if you put a cochlear implant on, it's not exactly the same. They wouldn't perform the same as the hearing children. So you can't compare the two. You really can't match. But if it's language, you're still missing in things because with the technology, they're still not on par with the hearing children. So I think it still goes to the biological.
That's true, but let me elaborate on that. You're right. They both fit. Why does this not include signing kids? So you don't see kids with a cochlear implant that had full access to a natural language during the critical period. So that's not being measured. So this kind of study model has been very common, not including children who sign. It just looks at the difference between auditory stimulation, or excuse me, the auditory domain. So a confounder is something that you didn't even consider in your research design, but that actually could simplify your results, because it could also actually change your results. And without that confounder in, your results become biased. There has been research in both areas, but the vast majority has been in the auditory domain. And they haven't ruled out language deprivation as perhaps the cause for this. The group in yellow, we see them over here as well. That's the best group out of the three in the second chart. And this was done under the age of 18 months. I beg your pardon, were implanted under the age of 18 months. I know it's really hard for you guys to see, I apologize. But you can see where the certain colored areas show much greater variability. The researchers on these children who were cochlear implanted say that the performance is better before 18 months than the children who had their implant as late as 36 months. And that led to a push for early implantation. But for me, I think there's a confounder here. If you look at this area here, each line is one kid from the study. We have one here that's flat. We have a hearing kid that does not go towards the top of his group. So we need to know what these kids' daily lives look like. Do they have pleasurable contact with peers? If not, that leads to other kinds of delays that will confound this. So often, these things get lost in research, and we also forget that these data points are people with real lives and experiences. This study, again, was of children with cochlear implants, and it was done in Iran. There was a researcher who saw the previous study and was wondering what would happen if you also looked at signing kids from deaf families who also received a cochlear implant. He predicted that those who signed would underperform. This was a test to see how well they could hear a sentence and then reproduce it. That shows that they comprehended it. This shows how clearly they can pronounce speech intelligibility. This just shows how well they can hear. It's not at all any kind of a signing test, it's all auditory based. The red line, those are the signing kids. The blue line are the non-signing kids. And in every one of these, you see the same thing. Now, is this a result of language deprivation or auditory deprivation? Why are the hearing kids underperforming?
They didn't have language.
Yeah. So that confutes auditory deprivation with language deprivation, but really they need to be teased out. You see that the kids who had the implant but also had the signing families outperformed the other kids. Are you all surprised by this, or does it make sense intuitively?
Makes sense.
Why is that? Why do you think that makes sense?
Language access, and the brain knows the difference between hearing and speaking it, or signing it and reading it, whether it's a visual language or an auditory language. It shouldn't matter.
Exactly. The signing kids outperform non-signing kids on these auditory measures. But we would expect them to still be behind hearing students, right? Well, let's see. Now this is a different design. We've seen the non-signing kids behind hearing kids previously. But we might predict that the signing kids might still underperform compared to hearing kids. And so, let's look at bilingual children. This is another group of people who acquire both ASL and English. And who might they be? CODAs, of course. CODAs, in this case, K-CODAs. They do develop differently than many children learning just one language, one of the languages. So, now we have the kids who are implanted either signing or non, and then signing kids having hearing siblings who hear and also are in this bridge signing environment. This is just another example of their language test scores. The black line shows the kids who have implants, cochlear implants, and then the lighter line shows the CODA kids' performance. And they're pretty much the same. Are we worried about CODA's language development? No. They often become our interpreters, and they're fully bilingual, and there's no problem. We don't exhibit the same concern for their development as we do for these kids with cochlear implants. So I wonder what's going on there. Does auditory deprivation account for that, or language deprivation? Why do you say that?
Well, you know, you look here, and the two lines are almost the same. The deaf kids, the CODA kids, means they have access to the language at home.
Remember, the prediction has been that auditory prediction would have bad consequences due to the lack of access to sound. And this cochlear implant does not make a child hearing. It provides some auditory support to some degree of greater access to auditory input. That doesn't account for why these children, CODA and signing implanted kids, perform so similarly. Are you with me so far? So this already gives us some counter evidence. And the reason why I wanted to talk about the research data on cochlear implants is because in that field, it's the strong impetus to tell parents not to sign at all, because that will have an adverse effect. But now we're seeing that the ability to sign can actually help the students' use of what stimulation they get auditorily from their implant, which is exactly the opposite of what this other group wants. They really want it to be the focus to be solely on auditory deprivation and then auditory access. So the predictions made from the auditory deprivation model clearly don't account for what we see. And the research design does not include the effects of language. All the research designs for deaf kids all have a confound because they don't look at the effects of language deprivation, and that brings all the results into question. When you take language deprivation into account, that still can account for the findings. And that's why I feel like it's a dry hot dog. Why talk about it further? Can I have the next slide, please? Remember I was talking about how there comes a point when biology slows down because the brain thinks it learns all it needs to learn, and then experience takes over. But now we're talking about kids who have both continued experience of language as well as their biological development. Deaf kids with implants from a hearing family, where they probably don't sign, meaning the kids don't sign, they can't access family communication, they fall far behind, as indicated by this dotted red line. And that's because the parents are told not to sign. And then maybe the kid's not implanted until the age of 1, 1.5, 2. Does the brain have no language exposure until that time? What happens during the time prior to the implantation? That there's nothing there. And then when they have the cochlear implants, the brain doesn't know what to do with that, whatever input they're getting at that point. It doesn't understand how to use it. So they don't immediately start benefiting from exposure to auditory language. You see the very slow, the low slope. And then see what happens at the age of 5. The brain moves on. The brain's like, oh, enough of that hard work on that, I have other fish to fry. So I'm going to move on, and that's biologically determined. The biological critical period is over, and that's long been established in the literature. Consequences of auditory deprivation are more accurately described as consequences of language deprivation. The lowered expectations on deaf children is not that they're deaf, it's that they don't have access to language. Audition does not equal language development. I mean, we don't need to invent the perfect solution. We've had it all along. It's a natural sign language, and giving the child exposure to that will spur their brain development. Sign language is more effective at preventing language deprivation than auditory deprivation. It's time to use our strengths that we've always had. Even if a child is able to develop both the spoken language and a sign language, it's time for us to support both. And I think that's an option that needs to be more seriously and widely considered. But is signing normally offered as an option? No, but the brain development requires that access to an accessible language right from the get-go. You can't wait until children get to school. There's tons of data to support that. So auditory deprivation does not equal language deprivation. And here's your discussion question for you all to hash out. Why do less than 10% of deaf children in America and less than 2% worldwide receive early sign language exposure when all little research evidence and everyday experience of deaf people shows the neurocognitive benefits of early sign language exposure? And then I'm going to jump to number 3 here. I've talked with a lot of psychologists and linguists, educators out there. And often I play dumb. And I say, what? Sign language really is considered a real language in your field? When in my world, we've moved on from that. As early as the work of William Stokey in the 1960s identified the nature of sign language as a full language. But the early intervention for deaf students in an educational setting still goes round and round about what to do. So I want to ask why it is that kids don't have the early exposure to an accessible sign language when